My name is Sylvia Turrell. I am a member of the American Club of Lille, and I will be your moderator for this evening. As we sit here, I realize that we're sitting here in Lille, in northern France, and we're all here with a bit of worry about an election that's going to take place in a week, in a country which is over 3,000 kilometers away. And yet, maybe our fears and worries are warranted because all the local newspapers, for instance, I keep on repeating that this election will be the one that will change the future of the world. And so maybe we are sitting here with each one with his own whats, whys, what ifs, and we have all of those questions moving around. And luckily, not really by luck, we have two speakers here who might help us be able to organize or orient our thoughts and be able to answer some of our questions. But before we get started, I would like to thank the people who have made this evening possible. First of all, the members of the American Club of Lille, who've worked really hard with the organization. Obviously, the École Supérieure de Journalisme for allowing us to have use of this beautiful auditorium. Thank you very much. Okay, so now I think at this point I will go and I will present our two speakers. And the first one on my left is Anne Deysine. And Anne is Emeritus Professor at the University of Paris in Nanterre. She's also part of the Montaigne Institut, which proposes studies and debates on public politics. Both a lawyer and a specialist in the Americas. Her particular interests are United States politics and the US Supreme Court. And is very involved in teaching abroad and works with several ONGs, and I point out particularly the National Democratic Institute. She also works with the US Bar Association on subjects pertaining to human rights, democracy, and the electoral system. Her various activities have earned her the title of the professor who has one foot in France and one foot on the other side of the Atlantic. The titles of some of her books and publications demonstrate the scope of her expertise. 1998, Justice in the US, Money and Elections in the US, the presidential campaign of 2012, the Supreme Court of the United States, Law, Politics, and Democracy, 2015. 2019, the United States and Democracy. And just this year, just hot off the press, we have the Judges Against America, the capture of the Supreme Court of the radical right. And that really, yes, it's right hot off the press. Now, you might also have seen Anne on television because she has several podcasts, but she often takes part in debates on BFM. And you might have seen her in some appearances on Channel 5's C'est dans l'air. So this is Anne. Our second speaker is Laurence and Nardon. Okay, and she had her PhD from Sciences Po. She followed up with a postdoc at Canterbury University in Kent, England, and a Fulbright scholarship at George Washington University in Washington, D.C., where the subject was Strategic and International Studies. She now heads the Division of Politics of the Americas at IFRI. IFRI is the Institut Français des Relations Internationales. And her lines of expertise lie in the history of political ideas in the U.S., foreign policies of the U.S. and their transatlantic relations, politics of commerce, technological innovations, and relations with China. Since 2019, she delivers a regular podcast on Wednesdays called The New Deal, in which she analyzes the stakes of events occurring in the U.S. political arena. Some good examples of her books and publications are those which have come out just this year. Economic Program of Kamala Harris, The United States, The Troubled Empire, and her latest, which just came out, Geopolitics of American Power, What role for the US in the world? She forgot to bring a copy, so you can look at her telephone. Okay, so I'm going to give the floor first to Laurence. Laurence, I'm going to just start it out with saying, what would the geopolitical arena look like, or what would the differences be under Trump or Harris?
So you launched me right away on a rather difficult question. What the geopolitical perspectives are, whether we have a Trump 2 administration or a Kamala Harris administration. It's a difficult question because the answer is different if you look at what they say, if you listen to each of the candidates and believe what they say, and then if you think a bit more and look at what they've done before and who their advisors might be, if they're elected for real, then it becomes a different story. It's further complicated by the fact that whether you look at China and Taiwan, let's call it crisis 1, if you look at the Middle East, Iran, the Palestinians, Hamas, Israel, let's call that crisis 2. Or if you look at crisis 3, which is of course Russia, Ukraine, and the transatlantic relation. On each of these three dossiers, as we would say in French, or hotspot, as they say in America, the answer also is different. So if I think I'm going to spend my 10 minutes trying to go through your question, if that's all right with you. Let's go back to the top. If you listen to Kamala Harris on all these issues, she seems to be following the Biden playbook, which is let's make America a moral compass for the world again. After the 4 years of Trump, that's what Biden decided to do when he came to power. And she has been saying that she would do that. Remember her speech at the convention that was in August, on August 22nd, so not too long ago. She had to strike a very forceful note on what she would do as commander-in-chief. So she gave us that rather virile speech on, I will make America's military forces very strong, and I will stand behind every serviceman or servicewoman, blah, 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 and we will continue defending Ukraine because it's a democracy that has been attacked by an autocracy. The same discourse Biden has been holding for 4 years, and indeed, Kamala Harris came to Europe many times. She came to the Munich Security Conference 3 times to assure Ukrainians and Europeans that America was there, the US was there behind them and very strongly in support. So that's what she says. She also said that she will be very vigilant on China and on the Middle East. Her discourse has been more difficult already. You can begin to see how difficult her position as president would be on the Israeli-Hamas situation. Because, as you know, her electorate is split almost perfectly in 2, between the moderate Democrats who support Israel and are very keen to continue to help that country, even if they don't really like the present government in Tel Aviv or Jerusalem. And the second half of her party is, of course, the radical left of the Democratic Party, who has been extolling a very strong pro-Palestinian stance ever since the October 7th attack. Rather rapidly after the 7th of October attack of 23. Actually, I don't know if Anne will agree with me, but I have never heard such strong pro-Palestinian views in the US ever, as I have seen this year, especially in the spring on the campuses throughout America. You had all these young students, being extremely anti-Israel and pro-Palestinians. I'm not going to say pro-Hamas because that's going too far, but this is something I had never witnessed. And so this is rather new, and Biden, when he was candidate, and Kamala Harris, ever since she became candidate, have been treading extremely cautiously around this issue, and if she were to be elected, this would continue to be a headache for her. We'll get into, well, no, let's do that. I was going to say, let's get into concrete suppositions after, but let's do that now. Suppose she's elected, I would think that she will continue to authorize weapon deliveries to Israel. That's what Biden has been doing, but she will attach conditions in terms of humanitarian aid to the Israeli government. The Israeli government will not respect the conditions, but she will not dare to stop the deliveries. Whereas Trump, and let me spoil this a bit by answering that right away. If Trump is elected, as you know, his full electorate is very pro-Israel, and when I say pro-Israel, I really mean to say that the Republican electorate nowadays is extremely pro-Likud. They're all, almost Likudniks, as the Israelis say. And so Trump, in a way, will have a much wider margin of maneuver if he's elected regarding Israel, because of course he will come in with that image of being extremely supportive of the country and extremely anti-Iran, that's true, anti-Palestinians, he doesn't really care about them. So he will deliver weapons, left, right and center to Israel. But imagine, this is a supposition, but imagine that in 6 months' time, for instance, or a year, Trump is elected, he's sitting in the White House, and let's say a very, very horrible Israeli attack takes place somewhere in, say, Lebanon or somewhere. Well, I would summarize, I reckon Trump would be in a position to refuse a weapons delivery to Israel, because he doesn't really like Netanyahu. The two men don't like each other, even though they're both nationalist, xenophobic, extreme right leaders. They still don't get along. And imagine that Trump would gets angry about, the buzz in the media around, because that's always what gets to him, around, a particularly horrific attack. Well, then he would be able to say, I'm not going to deliver the weapons. She wouldn't, because her political cost to her would be too strong. But I do believe that for him it wouldn't be that strong. But that's an extreme case, that's an extreme hypothesis, so let's forget that. Let's go back to Kamala Harris and what she would do if she's elected. So I covered the Middle East. Now, regarding Europe, as I said, ever since she's been candidate and before as VP, she was very pro-Ukraine. And now, if she's elected, what will happen? I'm not too sure she would go on being pro-Ukraine, as she has been, as the Biden administration has been these past years. Because when you talk to Democrats these days, they're very embarrassed by the Ukraine situation, because they will say things like, everybody knows we don't give Ukrainians enough weapons for them to win the war, because we're afraid of retaliation by Moscow. You know that Putin has threatened Poland with nuclear tactical strikes. That was in September of 22. I believe he also threatened the UK with strikes, but I forget if they were nuclear strikes. But anyway, so the whole West has been sending weapons, but never enough. It's like we're pulling them by the hair outside of the water so they can breathe, but we don't really allow them to get out of the pool altogether. So I'm not saying it's our fault. It's the Kremlin's fault to begin with, but they haven't had enough weapons to actually win the war, and we've seen the situation on the theaters of operation around on the borders of Ukraine and in the regions. It's a war like 14-18. It's a war of position. Nobody's, it seems like, that's my daughter. it seems like they're not going to be able to win that war. I'm talking about the Ukrainians. And we are not going to change our policy and risk war, direct war with the Russians. And so, when you speak to Democrats these days, they will reluctantly come to the conclusion that they're going to have to do something to get out of that war and end that war. And so, it will not be as brutal as Trump, who, as you know, has said many times, this is actually one of the issues on which he has never changed opinion, contrary to all the other issues, such as abortion, you know. So that's the one issue on which he has always said that on day one, he will end, even before, even if he's during the transition, if he's elected, he will make it sure that there is no more support and no more weapons being sent, and it will take him 24 hours to organize negotiations between Russians and Ukrainians. You've heard that, right? In 24 hours, he will organize peace. Anyway, so we know what he's going to do, and we can be rather sure that he will do it if he's elected. Now, again, if Kamala Harris is elected, I believe that she will probably have to get on that same path. It will not be as brutal, it will certainly not be immediate, but her and her probable advisor for national security or Secretary of State Phil Gordon, who's his advisor for international affairs, and who will probably become one of those two office roles in the Kamala Harris administration, they will embark on that path towards negotiating something to arrange peace. So that's what she would do. And China, okay, so that's an easy one, because on China, that's the one issue on which there is almost no difference between Democrats and Republicans these days. And as you know, there are very, very few issues on which the two parties say the same thing. China is one of them. And so they will continue to be, I don't know if hostile is too much. I think hostile is too strong a word, because they have so much going on in terms of trade and financial interconnection. But they will certainly continue to be protectionists, raise tariffs, that's Trump, continue to limit exportation of high-level technologies, that's Harris, and they will continue to dance that delicate dance of strategic ambiguity, that's the official name of the American policy concerning Taiwan, and that's been the official policy ever since 1979, when the US recognized official China. At that time, they decided that they would not take a clear official position on Taiwan. They would remain in strategic ambiguity, which means they tell the Chinese, oh yes, of course Taiwan is yours, and someday, but not now, you'll get it back, but let's talk about other things. And then to the Taiwanese, they say, how many weapons do you need and how many instructors do you need, and we'll send that along to you. And so this sort of bizarre policy has allowed not complete, but rather efficient stability, in fact, in the region, and the Chinese haven't dared yet to actually invade the country. I don't have a crystal ball, and I don't know what they're going to do, but we could, they haven't invaded so far, and so let's knock on wood. So the two candidates would probably continue the same policy towards China. You can make sense of everything that I've said, because, so as you see, the two candidates don't say the same thing on all the three dossiers, and we should go further than what they actually say to imagine what they would actually do.
Can I throw in one word, NATO?
Oh, NATO. Yeah. So Trump hates all coalitions and alliances because he's a nationalist who doesn't believe in common action abroad, and so he hates the EU, that's for sure, and he's deeply skeptical of NATO. Kamala Harris is all for NATO, that she loves. She's been over to Brussels many times to discuss NATO. But he said, okay, so during his first term, as you may know, he tried to leave NATO and was, was talked into not doing it. Now, today, if you go on his website, I'm not talking about Project 2025, but you're going to talk about it.
Yeah, probably.
Well, we'll see. But anyway, if you go to Trump's own website, you can read his actual words regarding NATO. And what he says on his campaign website is, if I am elected, I will I will reassess the value of NATO. And according to what I find out after my reassessment, we may or may not leave NATO. So the door is still open for him to decide to leave NATO. Now, it's interesting because Congress people have Marco Rubio, who's a Republican, and a Democrat, I forget his name. Last year, at the end of 23, they slipped rather surreptitiously an amendment in a budget law that passed Congress. And in that amendment, in the law, it says that no president can decide on his or her own that the US is going to leave NATO. If he or she wants to leave NATO, then he or she will need an act of Congress to do so. So, looking forward, Trump will not be able to decide on his own that the US is leaving NATO. But, one last word, is that, so that sounds rather secure for US belonging to NATO, but, there is a very strong thing that is called, I'll say it in French, la parole performative discourse. You know what that is? It's when a mayor says, a mayor says, I declare you man and wife. That's performative discourse. The fact that he says it makes them married. In a marriage ceremony. Okay, but if Trump says, okay, I can't leave NATO, but I decide that I will not respect Article 5, which is the article of the NATO treaty that makes it so that countries have to help each other within the alliance. The mere fact that the US president says such a thing, such a sentence, I don't care about Article 5, I will not respect it, makes it so that nobody will believe in the protection of NATO anymore. And that will be performative discourse by Trump. So that's not so reassuring after all.
Okay. Thank you very much. Let Anne go on. And Anne, I'll say that we have so many questions about the Supreme Court. Just take it.
First of all, yesterday I was on TV at Pujadas on NCI, and he started by saying, the US is a democracy. I said, no. So that's the first thing I'd like you to really realize. The US is not a democracy. Maybe the US was a democracy for 20 years, between 1953, desegregation, and the beginning of the Supreme Court destroying everything, let's say, end of the 1970s, okay? The US is, and this is when the founding fathers wanted a republic. That is to say, a representative government. Right. And when we look at the Electoral College, this is evidence that this is not a democracy. Because in a democracy, Hillary Clinton would have been elected into 2016 because she has 3 million votes more than Mr. Trump. And when we look at the results in 2020, of course Biden got elected, but he had 7 million more votes and only a few members of the Electoral College. So that shows you that the negotiation that took place in 1787 between the founding fathers had nothing to do about creating a democracy. They wanted to make sure that the 13 colonies would sign and ratify the Constitution. So they had to agree to a number of compromises. One is terrible, this is the 3/5, about the slaves, counting 3/5, so that the slaves in the South have representation in the House of Representatives. And the second compromise is 2 senators per state, because the little states were afraid they were going to be eaten up by the big states. So they say, we have the House based on population, okay, big states, many representatives, but in the Senate, this is the principle of federalism, 2 senators per state. So now we have Wyoming, 500,000 inhabitants, and California, maybe 50 million people, and 2 senators. And that explains many of the problems in Congress. But the result, the second compromise, is the Electoral College. Again, the states said, we don't want universal suffrage. So this is something that nobody had realized in France until 2000. Remember 2000, the chaos in Florida between Al Gore, the Democratic candidate, and George W. Bush, and everybody was counting the ballots and looking, is that a chat, whatever, and everybody realized that not only it's not universal suffrage, but each state can decide how they run elections, how they organize election, and each county can decide how to draw their ballots. And one problem was the butterfly ballot. It was so badly designed that many of the voters that wanted to vote for Gore, in fact, voted for the environmentalist candidate Nanterre. And in the end, anyway, there was no counting because the Supreme Court said, well, let's stop the counting and let's give the victory to W. Bush. And that's interesting. I was discussing with Robert on the way here because we're talking about 2000, okay, that's 25 years ago, before. At the time, there was, of course, an uproar among the Democrats that the Supreme Court should not have interfered and should not have ruled. Like, this is a very bad legal decision. It's not well written, it's not motivated, it's a catastrophe. But Al Gore said, okay, and there was no riot, no revolution. Now, we don't know what's going to happen if there are some decisions. The Supreme Court, but I'll say a little more about the court in a minute, but the Supreme Court has lost so much in terms of image. It is so criticized as being partisan that I am not sure an opinion, it's called an opinion, a decision by the Supreme Court will be accepted by the majority of the population. Anyway, so first characteristic, we don't have democracy. Second, the founding fathers they had one aim, besides creating that constitution, because the previous constitution, called the Articles of Confederation, did not work, because there was no federal power, no possibility to raise taxes, etc. They wanted to prevent the emergence of tyranny, because they had in mind the king, the British Parliament, and no way they were going to reproduce that. So if you have looked at the US Constitution, you know that Article 1 deals with the legislative power. Not, I'm sure some of you study politics in here, you know, in France, the whole beginning of the Constitution is about the president, the government, the relationship between the president and the prime minister, etc. And it's only at the very end that we mention the Parlement, and at the very end that we mention l'autorité judiciaire. It's not even a power, it's une autorité judiciaire. Very different in the American Constitution. Article 1. Congress, Article 2, the President, Article 3, the Judiciary, which is a co-equal branch. Now, what happens is that with all those mechanisms of checks and balances included in the Constitution, we've reached the opposite of what they wanted. We have, in fact, the tyranny of the minority. With the 2 senators per state, we have, in fact, 40% of the Senate, 40 senators, who in fact represent the small rural states that can block any law that the majority wants. And those rural states represent only 40% of the national product. They are not the wealth of America, but they can block everything. They can block economic measures, but they can block social measures as well. So, and we have lots of examples of that tyranny of the majority. in the Constitution itself. Now, the second point I'd like you to realize is that since the states can decide how elections are run, in the many states that are governed by Republicans, since 2013, and I'll explain what that date, they have changed the rules to make voting more difficult, and especially more difficult for minorities. Let's take the example of Texas or Florida. The legislature is dominated by Republicans. So they wrote laws that change the way people can vote. For instance, they will close voting stations in the districts where there are lots of minorities. You may remember in 2020 they had closed Georgia. They had closed so many of those offices that some people stood in line for 7 hours to be able to vote. And at that time I was telling everybody, I'm not sure I would have been as civic to stand 7 hours just to be able to vote. So the Republicans were trying to dissuade the voters from voting, and it had a reverse effect. They were so attached to their right to vote that they made that huge effort of standing in line. And just as a little joke, the Republicans were so furious that the following year they voted another law that made it a crime for groups and people to distribute water and sandwiches to the people standing in line. Okay? So just one example of what the Republicans do. Another example, they just purge the lists. They decide that this guy is not a citizen. There is no basis, but maybe it's called Fernandez, and there's another Fernandez, so and we have several examples in many of the swing states of the Secretary of State, which in the states is in charge of elections, just purging 3,000 names in several. And so when we know that the victory in Pennsylvania, in Georgia, in those states is often 10,000 votes, and you purge 3,000, that's a lot. That's a third of the majority that is necessary to win the states. Also, they make it more difficult to vote by mail. You remember that Trump is always saying, this is terrible, this is fraud, and because of mail voting, there's lots of fraud. Of course, there are many studies conducted by very serious centers. One of them is the Brennan Center, which is part of New York University. And they calculate that the rate of fraud, not necessarily linked to a non-citizen voting, okay, is 0.003%, okay? So we're talking about 10 or 20 examples out of several millions. But this is the approach of Republicans since the 1990s. They pretend to fight for integrity of elections. They pretend to denounce fraud, and this is an excuse to change the rule of the game. So they've been doing that since 2013, because the Supreme Court, in a decision called Shelby, which is the name of a county, decided that 2 sections of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 were invalid. Just a little backtrack. After the Civil War, there were 3 amendments. You remember, abolition of slavery, equal protection of the law, 14th Amendment. The states cannot prevent people from voting, 15th Amendment, on the basis of race or former slavery. But nothing happened because the states in the South found ways to go around the prohibition. Okay, this is what we call the Jim Crow period. For instance, yes, they can vote, but only they can give a very detailed explanation of the Constitution. Of course, nobody can do that. Me, because I love it. And so, because that new law would have prevented white people from voting, because nobody could do that, they invented the grandfather clause. So, if your grandfather voted, even though you cannot understand the Constitution, you can vote. And this is how, in fact, in spite of the 3 amendments, the blacks could not vote. So we have to wait 1965 voting rights law, which said if a state wants to change the election law, they have to go to the Department of Justice that will look at what they want to do and will say yes or no. And the Department of Justice, most of the time, said, no, you can't do that. And the result was the number of registered voters, black voters, African American voters, went up to the roof, the number of voters. But this is what the Republicans did not like, because they realized they are becoming a minority. There are lots of demographic figures they're panicked about, saying that in 2035, 40, the majority of the people of the population will be non-white. So they started, with the help of the Supreme Court, now that they didn't have to check with the Department of Justice, they changed the rules in order to make voting more difficult for the minority. One way that's very efficient is to request a special identity card. You may not know, but in the US, I remember going to vote with my friends many years ago, you could vote without even showing an ID. And even if you have to show ID, your driving license is enough. Though the Republicans are saying, no, we can't do that. We need a special ID for voting. Excuse me, with a photo. And many minorities are afraid. And they don't do that. And anyway, the location where they can get the card is usually 10 miles out of the city with no bus, no nothings, and with opening hours between when nobody can go there. So that makes it difficult. But they realize that the people manage to have the card. So now they said, in order to register, you need to bring proof of citizenship. And many people don't have the paper because they've been citizens for a long time. And so many of those cases are now before the courts because the Democrats and the Human Rights, the Voting Rights Association, etc., sue in order to try to stop those states from implementing those rules. So it is in this context that the election is going to take place. With something else, the same legislatures, especially in the South, in the Bible Belt, have dealt with redistricting. Every 10 years, there is a census. We count the population. Some people in the north, some states in the north tend to lose population, so they will lose representatives. And some states in the south gain population, so they have more seats. Therefore, we need to redistrict. And usually, and now it's very easy with computers, they will draw the constituencies so as to cheat. In North Carolina, for instance, which is divided almost equally, when it was equal redistricting for a short period, because now they've gone back to gerrymandering, it was 7-7. Now, the Republicans have, I think, like 14, no, it can't be 7-7. Anyway, but they have a huge advantage just by changing the size of the constituencies. And this thing is called gerrymandering. It's not recent. It's in the 19th century. A governor, Gerry, draw the size of his constituency to make sure he would be elected in the shape of a salamander. So when you add Gerry and salamander, that's gerrymandering. And it means, and now with the computers, it's very effective and very dangerous. So the elections are going to take place with all the things by the Republicans, with gerrymandering, and the third one, of course, is the role of money in the elections. So you probably have heard that Kamala Harris raised $1 billion. Yeah. $1 billion, yes, the last month, which is huge, especially when you compare with the figures in France, back home, spending 32 million countries. So anyway, but the real problem is not the money raised by the candidates. That's too much money, but at least, if a candidate can appeal to people, and the people want to pay $50, $200, okay, that's fine. The money that I'm worried about is what we call dark money. And dark money, again, the result of another Supreme Court decision called Citizens United in 2010, and the continuation of an interpretation of the First Amendment. So let me backtrack 1 second. The First Amendment, in theory, says that the state, first the federal government, but now through a process called incorporation in the states, cannot infringe, cannot limit freedom of speech, but also freedom of religion, etc., but freedom of speech. And the Supreme Court has considered that when you spend money, this is like expressing your thought. Therefore, money cannot be limited. So that political parties can spend, candidates can spend without limits. This is bad enough. But in 2010, the Supreme Court said, well, yes, but if somebody is very rich and wants to spend a lot of money, well, we can't prevent that person from expressing their preferences. And so the court said, this freedom of speech applies not only to individuals, but it applies to corporations and to billionaires. So my worry is not the 1 billion raised by Harris. My worry is Mr. Musk creating a super PAC, giving his own money to the super PAC, then lying on his social network X about Asians eating dogs and cats, both, and many other lies, and then amplifying those lies thanks to the advertising paid by the super PAC. In his case, at least we know that he's paying. In other cases, there is a mechanism with what we call a 501 group anyway, so that we don't even know who is paying. We just know that a group, we don't know how this group is financed, a group spends millions of dollars in ads, and the ads are, for instance, pro-life. So if you're a Democratic candidate, and against you there are tons of advertisements, of commercials pro-life, well, it's more difficult to win your election. And of course, you realize that the amount of money is not that important if you think of the country. But if you think about $50 million being poured in one race or one swing state for the presidential election, then you realize the weight of money. And a long time ago, when the Supreme Court was liberal, in the sense of progressive, it had said 1 man, 1 vote. Well, this is no longer 1 man, 1 vote, because you have the rich people that can overwhelm the votes of the other. So, just moving like this, I said a few words about the Supreme Court. You have to realize it's very powerful, because it's the equivalent of the 3 courts in France, Cour de cassation, Conseil d'État, Conseil constitutionnel, plus the 2 European courts. That's number 1. Number 2, it can choose its cases. Cour de cassation, for instance, when there is a case, has to render a decision, not the Supreme Court. It receives every year 8,000 petitions, it's called, and it takes 60. So it means that the groups that are trying to get the court to change the law know how to act. And now that we have 6 radical right justices, thanks to Mr. Trump, those groups litigate in order to push certain subjects to the Supreme Court, knowing that it has already destroyed the right to an abortion, and now it's thinking about destroying the right to contraception, gay marriage. I am not even talking about trans rights, but it's also destroying the power of agencies to regulate, so that the Environmental Protection Agency can no longer try to regulate to stop or to limit global warming. But on the other hand, the same court expands the right to carry a gun and expands religious freedom by saying, well, you know, this company, it's a religious company. If they want to hire only people that are religious, they can do that. No, they can't. In theory, they are anti-discrimination law, but what the court is doing, in fact, is giving them permission to do what they want. So this is the situation today. Now, let's take the result of the election. let's assume Kamala Harris is elected. That would be good news for many people. In spite of the few differences in the three cases that Laurence discussed, I think many people will be relieved to have her. Now, can she do anything about it? And this is where we should also be interested in the results of congressional elections. Because if she has no majority, she can do nothing. At the time today, the polls, we're not so sure, but maybe the Democrats can recapture the House, which would be good news. But it would be very difficult for them to keep the majority of the Senate for reasons I can discuss if there are questions. And that's bad, because the Republicans will block all nominations. The power of the Senate is to approve the nominations of the President. Nominations of 4,000 people, the Secretary of States, the ministers, etc., plus federal judges. So we can assume she can nominate and get approved, no judge. That's bad. But that's the situation. If she cannot get any law voted, she will try to govern by executive order. Well, we know what happened to Obama. We know what happened to Biden when they tried to govern by executive order. One of the Republican groups goes to court and says, this is a violation of this and that. They're very creative, okay? The first court, and they select the first court in Florida or in Texas, because they know the judges will say that the executive order is a violation of whatever. Then, the two Supreme Courts that cover the two courts of appeal that cover the south of the US, the Court of Appeals for the 5th Circuit and the 11th Circuit, are extremely conservative. So the chances, like 99%, are that they will confirm the first decision. And if it goes to the Supreme Court, of course the Supreme Court says the agency cannot regulate, the President cannot do that. So, unfortunately, unless she has the majority in both chambers, she won't be able to do very much. Now, if Mr. Trump gets elected, well, the bad news, if he has a Senate majority, he's going to appoint another 250 judges. And if Thomas, for instance, decides to resign, instead of the old Justice Thomas, he will be able to appoint a judge, aged 45 years, who will sit for another 40 years. So that's very bad news. Now, he said, and this is a report by the Heritage Foundation called Project 2025, this project is so outrageous that, of course, the Democrats are running ads saying Trump will do that, and Trump felt compelled to say, no, it's not me, it is them, I don't know them, except that the them that drafted the big thing, 900 pages, are all the people that work with him. So it's not very credible to say I don't know them and I will do that. And so we can expect that he's going to get rid of all the civil servants so that he can appoint his little friends, loyal not to the Constitution but to him. We can expect that he's going to expand presidential power. He's going to deport 10 million immigrants, he had said so, and maybe invoke the Insurrection Act in violation of many things. So the big question is, what happened during his first term, where the courts and the Supreme Court say, no, you can't do that? Is it going to happen now? Now that the courts are stacked with Trump judges and 3 justices of the Supreme Court? And I am not sure that the answer is yes, especially when you remember the decision rendered by the court on the 1st of July on immunity of the president. This decision is just terrifying because it grants total immunity, almost total immunity. That's become very difficult to go after a former president for crimes committed during his term of office. Not only term, Trump, but also future presidents. So we have a court that is very much in favor of an expansion of presidential power and who has protected Donald Trump. So if Trump gets elected, in theory, the system of government in the US is checks and balances, and one check is the courts. But I think we won't have a big check with the present courts at the moment. Thank you.
I have one question just to add on from there. What about your disinformation? How is that playing and how can it be won?
Well, disinformation is also a product of the First Amendment. The First Amendment is so protective that anybody can lie, number one. You may remember that Trump lied 30,000 times during his 4 years in office. This is a lot. Yes, it is a lot. And at the end of his term, he would lie sometimes 50 times one day on his tweets. And today, I mean, in the last months, he has also increased the number of lies and conspiracy theories every day. Some people calculate in one meeting, like for instance, 16 lies and 2 or 3 conspiracy theories. And there is not much that can be done because, again, the First Amendment protects free speech, and free speech is supposed to include lies. Now, this information is, of course, not multiplied by social networks. And I refer to Musk. Musk has no moderation on X, and there's been a paper on the Washington Post recently showing that there are more and more extreme right people on X, and the Democrats tend to leave X because they are. The Washington Post doesn't say that. It doesn't say they have evidence, but apparently the Democrats are so ill-treated that they have fewer and fewer followers, whereas the Republicans have more and more followers. And since we have no visibility on the algorithm, it's very difficult to prove anything. But you just look at the phenomenon, more and more right-wing, fewer and fewer Democrats on X. Again, all other social networks enjoy immunity. They cannot be taken to court because of an interpretation, not by the Supreme Court this time, but the Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit, which interpreted a law of 1996, before there were the social networks, saying that we cannot go after social networks for the information that they just post. Because they are not editors, they are not publishers, like newspapers, who are responsible for what they write. They can be taken to court, they can be sued for defamation or whatever, but not social networks, total immunity. The law is very old, 1996, and Congress has never changed the law, and the courts have never changed their case law. So we have this situation where anything can be said and nothing happens in terms of punishment.
Okay.
Well, I was interested, the point you said was not covered was about the makeup of the electorate, because the suggestion is that the minorities will tend to vote Democrat, which has been a trope that has been consistent for many years. I'm interested to know what you think about these minorities.
Interesting, and indeed, I would say that, you know, given everything that Anne has been saying for the past half hour, makes it very bizarre to me and everyone in the room, I'm sure, that Trump is polling so well and maybe just about to be re-elected. How comes this is happening? How comes he still attracts to him so many of the US electorate? So there are many reasons for that.
Including black males.
Yeah.
The young black males who seem to be, well, I mean, in general, statistically, more of them are still voting for Kamala Harris, but not as much as you'd expect. And the loss is probably going to be very damaging to her. But let's not, you know, ne partons pas battus, let's not consider that this election is a done deal, otherwise, you know, it's too depressing. But, so the explanation for the numbers and for the fact that Kamala Harris is not doing, you know, she should be running away with this. She should
Misogyny. Sorry.
Pardon?
Misogyny.
Let her speak, please.
Well, yeah, probably, well, for the young white, for the young black African Americans, misogyny certainly occurs. But they'd rather vote for that guy than for that woman. African American woman also. She self-described.
All men, I'm sorry.
But I'm not too sure about that. Though.
I am.
That's a deep. Well, okay. Let's leave that for the moment. I think the reasons for the success of the Trump campaign are the economy, because even though, and that's very unfair, even though Joe Biden's economic policies, Bidenomics, have been, I believe, a tremendous change for America, and I would say in the end probably a good change for the middle class in America. The reasons are not showing yet, and what voters see is only the rate of inflation over the past 4 years. So now we know that inflation has gone down, the price of gas has gone down for the first time ever since ever since COVID, really. But voters are still very angry, and the person that they think is responsible for this state of affairs is Joe Biden, and so they believe that Trump will be a better president for them in terms of economic policy and the day-to-day cost of life. So that's one thing. And secondly, there are many reasons, so I will just talk about the economy. And the second reason I want to highlight tonight is the fact that democratic activists have been pushing for the past years policies that are, sadly, I'm sad to say, that are way too radical for the general democratic voters. Take, for instance, the Defund the Police program that was pushed after the
George Floyd.
I apologize. After the George Floyd episode, was pushed by many Black Lives Matter activists, but in fact, if you look at polls, it was very unpopular with the totality of the democratic electorate. Same thing for immigration, and same thing for a number of very important democratic lines of propositions that were way too radical for the electorate. And so it's, well, could I plunge on one topic that is, I think, very important and very misunderstood in France? I want to talk about abortion rights. So after Dobbs in June of 2022, thank you, Anne. So as you know, the states are now in charge of deciding what the right will be regarding abortion rights on their territory. So you have a number of very conservative states where incredibly harsh laws forbidding almost every case of abortion, even incest, rape, what have you, health of the mother. Some states such as Tennessee or Wisconsin or Alabama try to forbid all forms of abortion whatsoever. The laws for that were ready in '73. They were drafted right after Roe v. Wade because the states could draft any law because it would be unconstitutional. But comes the Dobbs decision in '22 that strikes down the federal guarantee of abortion right. The law comes into effect the next day. And that's why those conservative states have very harsh laws. And of course they are being contested in court, etc. Then you have many states in the US where the law is very, I'll get out of the wood and say what I really think. They're very sensible and very moderate, they make a lot of sense, and they resemble what we have in France. Abortion is allowed, no questions asked during the first trimester, and then you can have an abortion only if you have a good reason to, be it a familial or social reason or a medical reason. And that's what we have in France. And that's what many moderate US states have. But you mustn't, and that was it, and I must say that this was something I didn't know a few months ago. But on the other side of the spectrum, you also have 7 very progressive states in America where abortion is allowed always. There is no deadline. There is no deadline. And so when you see, and I didn't know that, and I went and I checked and I spoke to people, and it's true. It's not disinformation, and it's not complot, whatever. So when you have Trump or J.D. Vance or any crazy conservative saying on TV, look at those progressive states, they allow children to be killed when they're born. That's what J.D. Vance said only the other day. And of course it's not true. Infanticide is of course never allowed anywhere in the United States. But what they're really talking about is those late-term abortions that are allowed, I would say, for no medical reason in those 7 progressive states. So what I mean after this long description, please forgive me if I'm too long, is that for the person on the street in America, there is a feeling that people are going too far, and there are people who are too radical, too extreme on the 2 sides of the political spectrum. And so that leaves them in a very difficult place, because some of them may be tempted to say, oh, okay, so you have Trump who's insane, but you also have progressive who go too far, and so I don't know who to vote for. And the democratic choice that we, sitting here in Lille, find so easy to make, and so easy to do, and such a matter of fact, is not as easy for many, even democratic voters today.
Can I add something? Because it's the election that's most gender, to go back to what you were saying. I mean, the women are going to vote for the Democrats and the men are going to vote.
Yes.
And for many reasons. The ones described by Laurence, because on societal values, the Democrats are probably too much to the left. It's not their economic policies that pose problem, although the inflation, etc. It's the fact that why do they fight so much for trans rights? Of course it's important, but that makes many people uneasy. And then it's easy for the other side to describe them as being radical leftists that pay no attention to the people. So that's one difficulty. But I was reading something saying that, in fact, who votes for Kamala? Women, non-religious people, urban people, and higher education. And for Trump, we have the men, the rural, the religious people, and non-college education. And I think it's very true.
Laurence, we were talking about the white trash book. Can you give a short version of that?
It's a book by a historian woman, and she described the social structure of white people living in the Appalachian, and it's very interesting because most of them vote for Trump. And so, dans les Appalaches, there are 2 types of people in terms of sociology and in terms of where they came from. Half of them are Irish, are Scotch-Irish, which means Scottish people who were Protestants and who in the 16th century were moved over to Northern Ireland, where there were too many Catholics, and so the British government thought that by moving those Protestants from Scotland to Northern Ireland, it would take care of the situation. And so those guys moved to Northern Ireland, and they weren't too happy because it was very, very aggressive political setup, of course, for them to live there. And so they moved on from Ireland to North America in the 17th century, and they lived, so many of them in the Appalachian, where they form what we call today the Jacksonian tradition of America. They are very, they tend to be very clannish, very protective of their rights, and very, at the same time, isolationist. They don't want to be embroiled in things that they don't care about, such as democracies being attacked abroad. But also, if they feel under attack, they will be very aggressive. That's the Jacksonians and that's the Scotch-Irish. But there's another part of the population there, and that's really the hillbilly people who came as indented servants in America. And that's what the book is about. I will try and I will get the reference to you later. So, again, in the 16th, 17th century, a number of British people were very poor and they wanted to go to the Americas to make a new life for them. But they were too poor to pay for the transport on a boat. And so they found a boss already in America who would pay for the trip. And in exchange, those people would work for them, for the boss, for 7 years. And they would have no right whatsoever during those 7 years. And if they got sick or if they had to borrow money for some reason, the 7 years very often became 14 years or 21 years. And that status, it was not slavery, of course, but it was a sort of servitude that was very harsh. And they were called indented servants because they could not read. And they would draw a contract with the boss, and I have to drop my mic for a minute. The contract would be tiered into between the boss and the worker, and the way it was tiered, it made indentations on the paper. And so by putting the paper together again, then they would know it was actually the boss and themselves, and so they would know. And that's why they are called indented servants. And so I finish my point on those people. It's really transgenerational humiliation that they feel, and the hillbilly people today are the descendant of those indented servants. And that's why they cannot get out of that very poor and very hopeless status that they have, and that is so brilliantly described by none other than J.D. Vance in his biography, Hillbilly Elegy.
I get the impression that the absurdity that we're feeling is mostly coming from far-right television programs, newspapers, and what used to be called X. Hasn't that got an overwhelming power? Isn't that orientating their vote to more right Republican voting?
It's a country where there's never really been many federative media. The media fédérateur, I don't mean federal. It's not like in France where we have Le 20h or Le Monde. Le 20h, it's the same for everybody. In America, for one thing, you have five time zones, 6 if you count Alaska, 7 if you count Hawaii, and so you cannot have one journal télévisé at 8 p.m. at night. You don't have the news at 9. Because it's so forever, it's always been difficult to have one media that would bring people together. And well, it's too late to go into details, but ever since the 80s, radios have been exploded along with radical political minds. Same with the TVs in the 90s when you had cable TV, and then of course you had many radios already with the conservative radio talk shows that appeared at the end of the 80s. Then you had the cable TV who had to, pander to their audience and would tend to have more and more political, radical discourses to get hold of an audience and pay the ads that would, pay the workers on the cable TV. And then, of course, you had the internet, and then you had social networks. So I agree with you. Today in America, you have a media environment that is completely polarized, with many right-wing or extremely right-ish media. But you also have many progressive media. Take the New York Times or the Washington Post. And so, again, I do believe that most Americans are extremely decent and moderate people, but they do not have the media that will serve to moderate their views. They are pulled on one side or the other.
There's something that has disappeared from the media environment, and this is the role of local newspapers.
Yes, yes.
This is what people have trust in. This is what they read in small towns. And because they don't have the resources anymore, because advertising
Internet.
now goes to social networks, etc., we're talking about more than 12,000 newspapers, local newspapers, that have stopped their activities. So it means the people in those cities have nowhere to turn. So some of them will try to turn to the local station of NPR, National Public Radio, for instance, but others will just get their news on social networks. We know now that more than, depending on the age groups, but we're talking about 40-60% of people who get their news on social networks. And we know that the economic model on social networks is to amplify everything that's outrageous. So those people who get their news on social media get more and more polarized. And when people ask that, why don't people change their minds? Because of what Laurence is saying, polarization. If you're a Trump person, you'll watch Fox News or Newsmax, you will be one of those social blogs, whatever, and you will never, ever watch CNN, read the New York Times, and also there's no national newspapers. Maybe USA Today is one of them. Probably you could say the Wall Street Journal. But the New York Times is read almost everywhere, especially now online, but it used to be the East Coast, same thing for the Washington Post.
But what about ABC, NBC, CBS?
There's still those networks with local branches, and they still have the news at 6, etc. The problem is that, and we have the same in France. In France, families used to watch the news together, the 8 o'clock news. Now, the young will look at their phone, etc. It's no longer a common activity. And from what I have read, there are fewer people that watch the news on those 3 channels, which I think are more or less neutral, okay? More neutral than Fox News, for instance. But it's a question of limiting audience. So fewer people there and more on the social networks.
Okay.
Would you mind speaking a little bit about the differences between the US and France?
Okay, I don't mind speaking about the media because it's very different. One reason we have less polarization in France is because we have some rules. For instance, we have an institution called ARCOM, and that makes sure that a channel does not give too much time to one political party or one part of the political spectrum. And recently, the ARCOM has decided to cancel one channel that they'll have to stop emitting in, I think, February 2025. There is no such thing in America. Also, there used to be a rule called equal time, or the fairness doctrine, and the Republicans, you'll say I don't like the Republicans, but it just happens, it's the Republicans, during the Reagan administration, they did away with that. And that's why the local radios, the radio shows, can for 3 hours every morning, like Rush Limbaugh, say lies, conspiracy theories, and there is never one liberal, never one different view on those networks. It's just criticism of the federal government, religion, the right to bear arms, etc. For 3 hours, and nothing to counterbalance this unbalanced view.
Laurence?
There's also a new type of media that's been used in this campaign, and I want to talk about podcasts for a minute, because you've seen in those past weeks, the last stretch before the vote, Trump and Kamala Harris have both done a media blitz, each on its side and each addressing a number of media. Actually, she was brave enough to go on to Fox News when he refused to do 60 Minutes. But anyway, but they've both given interviews to podcasts that touch a very significant number of the electorate. So she did Call Her Daddy, that's a podcast that talks to sort of
Millennials.
older women. And he did a number of interviews on sort of male podcasts. And so I think it's, so nothing new, it's just a new format that they've been using, but here again you can see the polarization of the two types of podcasts and each candidate addressing more or less his or her camp.
In France, don't you limit the amount of media that you can spend before the election?
Yeah, in fact, political advertising is prohibited in France. So the only thing you can hear on the radio and watch on television is something organized by the government, which is extremely boring. It's like 2 minutes. I mean, that's true. I mean, I don't like political ads because they are terrible. You know, there's 30 seconds, they're negative, they're very bad for democracy. But at least, I mean, they are terrifying, but sometimes they're funny. Here it's very boring. You've got one guy in front of a statue or whatever, which explains, usually it's 2 minutes, it depends on the elections, it depends how many people, and that says a few words about the program, the platform of the party. And that's the only thing we can have on radio and on television, okay? Now, in terms of election spending, they are limited. The reason Macron didn't spend, and in fact there was a problem before a Commission des comptes because maybe he has cheated to be able to spend some more anyway. But the amount is very, very small as opposed to the huge amounts spent in the US. But yes, we don't have political ads, and it's interesting because I'm going to speak at a big thing at Conseil Constitutionnel in January. And one thing they want me to tell is show them as a sort of mathematical formula that political ads are a catastrophe, and we do not want to import them in France. Because some people think it would be a good idea.
Well, one last question. What would happen if Harris wins? Do you think it will be the beginning of a war? Would the Trump group actually attack the way they've threatened?
Another thing, you know, I was telling you earlier how Trump hasn't varied on one issue, which is what he would do if he's elected regarding Ukraine. But another thing on which he hasn't changed is the fact that he has said so many times that if he loses the election, then it's really that the other side has cheated. Which is very nice when you're running for an election to say that, it's true. But anyway, so he has said that he will not recognize the result of the election if he's not winning, if he hasn't won. Okay, so what happens next? So pundits and experts have all been saying that Kamala Harris would really need to win by a large margin to make it so that Trump goes quietly, even if, you know. But it seems that, okay, so let's imagine that she wins. It's pretty probable at this point that if she wins, she will win by a little margin, at least in terms of electoral college. Maybe not in terms of popular vote, but okay. And so he will not go quiet. So, what can we think now? So the first thing that is actually quite reassuring is that if he threatens to call his bases or a mob or whatever, like he did in 2021, the reassuring thing is that, at least in Washington, the federal capital, you will still have Joe Biden in command until January 21st, which is the day of the actual switch between him and the new president, Trump or Kamala Harris. So, if there's trouble until January 21st, we can be sure that Joe Biden will call the National Guard to restore order. You remember that on January 6, 2021, the reason things got so wild at the Capitol is that Trump refused to call the National Guard until 4 p.m. or something.
Yeah.
After which the situation got quite quickly in 2 more hours. But so okay, so we can be pretty sure that Joe Biden would make it so that there would not be a major riot getting out of hand, at least in the federal capital. You could have trouble in the states, and then you have to look at who's the governor. If it's a Republican governor, you don't really know what will happen unless it's in Georgia. That state really true to the constitution in 21. If it's a democratic state, of course, the governor will make it so that order prevails. The second thing is that many of the major rioters of 21, the head of the Proud Boys or the, what's the other one, Proud Boys?
Oath keepers.
Oath keepers, thank you. They're in jail now, and they haven't been let out. So, of course, there are others, there are new ones, so you don't know what will happen, but what do you think, Anne?
I think we must distinguish between physical violence and litigation. So in terms of violence, I agree with Laurence. I think now everyone is ready. There will be troops, the militia, the National Guard, etc. I don't expect too much trouble in DC. And in many of the states, even if they're Republican, I don't think they want the type of chaos that happened in DC on the 6th of January 2021. Now, litigation is a different matter. And also to add, I think there are quite a few people that would not be ready to do what the others did in January, because there are so many in jails, but so many, 1,500 that are being prosecuted, those in jail sometimes for 4, 5, 6, 7 years. So they understand that following Trump is not necessarily a good idea. So they like to cheer in the meetings. Now they're going to move to the step of doing something illegal, I'm not sure. But the problem is counting the ballots. The first danger is the night of the election. Is it going at 12 o'clock? Because in a few states, not counting the mail-in ballots is won, then he has won the election. And then what happens? And in many states, because they've changed the rules, for instance, they are trying to say we have to count by hand, which would take several days. In Arizona, I was just in Arizona, there are so many questions because there are referendum and initiatives that the ballot is like this and has 2 pages. And some people, only voting has started, take 20 minutes to fill the ballot. And it's very difficult then to put the ballot in the machine because it has 2 pages, etc. And of course, it's going to take forever to decide to count the votes. There will be problems about this ballot has only a page 1, what do we do, blah, blah, blah. And so the problem is, will the states be able to certify in time because the Constitution determines a number of deadlines, and one is mid-December, and there is fear that a couple of states, one of them Arizona, may not be ready in time. And then, what happens? And what happens on the 6th of January if we don't have certification of all the votes? Then the Republicans can say, in that case, the election has to be decided in the House. And in the House, not the number of representatives, but the number of delegation, the number of states. So it depends who has the majority of the states in January, that's to say, after the elections. So we have lots of question marks, and we're going to be busy for several days and probably several weeks stressing after the day of the election.
I think this has been a very interesting period. Unfortunately, we've gotten to the end, and I think we've answered a lot of questions, but also raised a lot of questions. So we're leaving, maybe not with the same questions we came with, but we're leaving with other questions. I want to thank both of our speakers, and I think that they will hang around for another 5 or 10 minutes if you want to ask questions afterwards. So thank you very much to the audience, and thank you very much to our speakers.